Okay. Don't worry, that's the only weird contrast thing in the entire deck. Logo on the left is my new company. We just started a company, Tilda. I'm still excited about having started it, so I'm still talking about it. The only reason I started a company was so that I would never have to take VC again. That's like my mission statement. That's the entire. Low-res Tilda is the logo, so. So I don't know why I decided to give a talk about JavaScript at a Ruby conference. I have, even though I do a lot of JavaScript, I am perfectly good at giving talks about Ruby and do on a regular basis. But I think, I think the reason why I decided to do this is that I came to the realization that most people in the Ruby community do not understand what a good JavaScript workflow looks like at all. It's not like a known unknown, it's like an unknown unknown. There's like, and I only have 30 minutes, so I can't really go through here is the perfect JavaScript workflow, and in general, it's still evolving. But what I hope to give you today is a sense that there are things that you can do that will make your workflow a lot better. And as Rails developers, we should care about this, because Rails makes our workflow orders of magnitude nicer for Ruby, and then you go to JavaScript, and all of a sudden the entire thing is a disaster. And I've said to DHH before that I think that the reason why we are losing people to Node in the people who did Rails and are doing client-side stuff is that the client-side story is so bad, not just for us but everybody, that you suddenly don't feel like you're getting a lot from Rails anymore, even though you are. So what I usually say is you gain 3 weeks of time at the beginning of a project from Rails. So a normal project has 0 startup time. But now you've paid 3 weeks of time to set up your JavaScript environment in a good week, in a good month. And now it feels like you're not getting the nice quick startup experience anymore. And I think as the Ruby community, we are in a good position to actually care, because everyone in this room wants a good experience more than a lot of other things. A lot of other people doing JavaScript care a lot more about I would like to be able to make a lot of choices about all the JavaScript libraries that I pick and use small ones and read all the code. And I think that we as a community actually care a lot more about having nice workflows. So I think we're in a good position to have them. So this talk is largely about workflow. I'm going to start with some elementary things, but I think things that people don't usually do. And I should also say that what I'm talking about here is predicated on having some kind of build system. I personally do not use the Rails asset pipeline and sprockets. It is okay though. It would be possible to implement everything I'm saying here in terms of those systems. So the first thing is getting your JavaScript house in order. And this is just a really simple thing that everyone should be doing, ideally not by hand. And it's dealing with JavaScript scopes. So if you just use the asset pipeline, you require a file, and your file looks like this. This is a pretty normal thing to do in jQuery. You have a function, you get JSON, document.ready. Unfortunately, that function, that load function, is in the global scope. And in general, in JavaScript, you do not want, it is okay to put things in the global scope. I'm actually an advocate of using the global scope as appropriate, but you should not be putting things in the global scope that do not need to be in the global scope and that you did by accident. So you should have a build step that does something like this, that wraps a closure around your file. Now, a lot of JavaScript people just do that themselves. They do that around every file. That's stupid. It's not a good idea to make people have to type something over and over and over again. That's the same. That's sort of the ethos of Rails. So you should have a build process that does this. If I was maintaining Sprockets, I would probably just make the JavaScript compiler do this and say that's how it works. And then basically the idea here is that this variable becomes a local variable. So now in files, conceptually, when you are in a file in your application, you are not accidentally leaking things into the global scope. And I don't want to go into a whole tirade about why it's bad, but it is actually bad and actually causes bugs. And so you don't want to do it. So here is some code from Ember. And I want to show you sort of our workflow, because the most advanced workflow I have for JavaScript is developing Ember itself. So I'm going to use that as an example. But everything I'm saying here applies to your app as well. So here I have some code. You can see that at the top of the file I have a require. Then I have a couple local variables. And mostly, this is not an important thing, but mostly we do this because extracting local variables from namespace things minifies better. So if you care about that, we care about that. Minifier can't tell that ember.get is the same every time, but it can tell that get is. But so this is fine. This is sort of standard top of a file in Ember. Like I said, we have some local variables. What if we, by mistake, forgot to use var, and we just said getPath equals ember.getPath? This has happened. In our setup in Vim, we will get an error, the equivalent of like Ruby-C failing. So we get an error that says you did something wrong. And it's actually part of the standard Janus distribution and the way it works under the hood. So if people don't know Janus, I maintain a Vim distribution that has all the things that I like and then a lot of other things people have contributed. I don't actually do most of the work these days. It's a guy named Whale. I don't know how to pronounce his name. But the idea basically is that you shouldn't have to like go figure out where to get the JS hint plugin. It should just be there. So it works using something called JS hint. If you don't know what raise your hand if you've heard of JS hint before. Okay, so anybody who hasn't, you need to learn about it. But basically the idea behind JS hint is that JavaScript is not like Ruby. There's a lot of things that you probably shouldn't be doing in JavaScript, even though they are legal syntax. So in Ruby, largely, things that you shouldn't be doing are not legal syntax. And things that are legal syntax, there are good reasons to do from time to time, right? In JavaScript, that is not the case. In JavaScript, there is a large number of things that you should have to be explicit if you're doing it on purpose, right? If you're doing something on purpose that is generally considered to be bad, you should know what you're doing. So a good example of this is like you probably shouldn't be using eval. It's fine sometimes to use it, but you should have to say like, I know I'm using eval for a good reason. So JS hint is basically just a tool that runs through a bunch of JavaScript and tells you what's going on. And what I said before about like you can say that you know what you're doing. So in this case, let's imagine that we were trying to leak a global on purpose. You can tell JS hint like, hey, that's okay for this file. I'm trying to leak this global. And there's actually two flags. There's like globals getPath, which basically says I know that when I say the word getPath, it means I'm trying to get a global. And that basically, if you don't say that, it's protecting you from typos, right? You said getPath without the H. It's like, hey, where did that come from? You're like accidentally going to get that from a global. You probably didn't mean that. And then if you say :true, that means that you're willing to set a global, which is like a bigger step. So just because you're saying like jQuery is a global in this file does not mean that you want jQuery equals to be valid, right? You probably did not mean to override jQuery. So so that's basically the two modes there. And again, this is relatively rare. Like most Ember files do not have any special overrides because by and large we have a style that is that works for everything. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. So again, globals. I should be advancing my slides. Globals getPath true basically just means like I know that I'm leaking a global here. It's on purpose. So the reason that this works out okay and you don't end up having to do a lot of work is that there's a file called jshint.rc that you can put in the root of your project, and you can put in all the globals that you know about in advance. So you can see that there's like browser true, and that's so like you can type in console.log and alert, and I think it maybe even includes jQuery. But basically you have a list of predefined, like these globals are allowed in my project, I know about them, and so I don't have to constantly tell you. And that way you can have a project where people are just going about their day, they make new files, everything's great, and then when they happen to go and do something wrong, they introduce a new global, then they get a warning. So it means that like only one person has to really think about what the house style is, right? JS hint also comes, my phone is going crazy here. I thought I put it on vibrate, I did. So JS hint also comes with a lot of options. By and large, like as a beginner, it's probably fine to go with the default options. I don't. There's a bunch of things that I just don't agree with about how their default style works. And actually, the reason JS hint exists primarily is because there was another thing that it forked off of called JS lint, which is not configurable. It's like, here are the rules. If you don't like them, please don't use JS lint. And there are a lot of people who were like, actually, I want to be able to say certain things, and then it will work. So if you're like an advanced JavaScript developer, you should definitely read these rules, understand how style is. Ember, so the default JS hint basically has a stack of these that default to false. You can see that there are a few cases where we have decided that we are okay with something, like boss mode, which lets you say if x equals blah, which is like a pretty standard Ruby idiom, but not that common in JavaScript. In JavaScript, when people do it, they're usually making a mistake. We are usually not making a mistake, and we don't like to have another line just to say the same thing. We are willing to have eval, etc. So the net result of this setup is that every file gets a scratchpad scope, so you can do whatever local variables you want. If you if you have been in a situation before where you were unwilling to just like make local variables because they're like not correct, having the freedom to just like make a local variable because of the fact that all functions in JavaScript have access to the entire file, it's actually a really nice refactoring. So JavaScript's OO is not very strong, but JavaScript's refactoring into functions is actually very strong, again, because of the fact that there's no hard scopes. You can see the entire file. So it's pretty common for me to like say, oh, I'm using the same functionality in multiple places. I don't really need to make an object here. I'll just take a function, I'll move it to the top of the file, give it a variable name, and then refactor into that. And that just improves the workflow. And you don't have to think about whether that's legal or not, whether you're leaking globals or whatever. It is actually very important for setting and getting globals to be an error. In my mind, it's basically an exception. It's basically Ruby-C failing, right? It's syntax error, unless you are like, what this is actually allowed. Just because in every single case where you did not think about it, you are doing it wrong. So it's important to be able to do this, and it's also important to be able to override it on a per file or per project scope. If you add a new library that has a global, you don't want to have to constantly say that's an allowed global. So when you're using JSLint, the general broken window theory applies. You want to be making sure that JSLint is actually running all the time. So for us, it's actually pretty easy. Most of us use Vim. Most of us have that plugin. You can run JSHint against an entire project. So here I'm running it against the Ember views directory, and I see there's no errors, right? We actually have it set up so that we can also run rake test. So rake test in Ember uses Phantom.js. How many people know about Phantom.js? Cool. So Phantom.js is basically like, it's basically a browser that doesn't bring up a browser and can do things like running tests. We did a bunch of work to make QUnit run well in it for our purposes. So you can see here we're running our tests. But the interesting thing about our test run is, so here let me go back and do the error again. If I run the test, it says, hey, module failed. That file should pass JSHint, and then it's like assertion fails. Right, and then it tells you like get path is not defined, right? So part of our test run is JSHint, right? So we can't run our tests without seeing mistakes. So it's basically almost everybody, even people who use TextMate to contribute to Ember, run the tests. So if they make a mistake, they will still see it even though they might not have a JSHint plugin. And that is also true about our test run in the browser, right? So if someone didn't run rake test and they run the test in the browser, they will also see this like, hey, Ember application should pass JSHint. The reason I'm spending a lot of time on JSHint, by the way, is because I think it's probably the #1 workflow enhancement that you can make to an existing project, because bugs in JavaScript take up a lot more time often than bugs in Ruby. So if you get stuck on a bug, you're basically screwed. And if it turns out it's like I leaked a global, that's like the most frustrating thing that could happen. So you could basically eliminate that entire class of bugs just by having a good JSHint workflow. And I actually got this idea to do it from the test from in Bundler. We actually have a test that's basically people have not added trailing whitespace because we got annoyed by like the amount of people using TextMate adding trailing whitespace. So if you contribute to Bundler and run the tests and you have trailing whitespace, there will be a failure that's like, hey, trailing whitespace, please fix. So we never get pull requests that have trailing whitespace, right? And so it's a similar thing. This is more serious, but similar thing. And then we also use Travis CI. So Phantom.js runs on Travis. This is not available for non-open source projects, but we basically run it. This is the first commit after we added JSHint to our test suite, and you can see that there were 273 failures, which were all JSHint failures after the first commit after we added it, and now it's clean. And so again, having our test suite, we have a rake task, we have Travis reporting on it. Like, it's basically impossible for things that we do not specifically allow in JSHint RC to creep into our code base. And the reason this is in the broken windows section, because actually when we first started, there were like hundreds of failures. And actually the vast majority of them were like missing semicolon, which by the way you could turn off, but probably shouldn't because it's confusing when you're allowed to leave off semicolons in JavaScript. Missing semicolon or whatever the things were, like maybe only 5 of them were actual bugs. But when we actually got down to the 5 of them, we were like, oh my God, we're leaking globals. This seems very bad, right? So getting down to the point where you could run a rake task and get a full JSLint report that includes largely new actual mistakes that you made is important, even though the first time you run JSHint, you will probably get a bunch of broken windows, right? It's okay. Go fix the broken windows. It's fine. In general, just confirm your code quality everywhere. This is kind of different from Ruby. Like I said before, like Ruby-C is largely good enough. If the code runs, it's not I mean, you could have big methods and you could run stuff like flog, but that's like a different level than like I am typing in a global and I didn't mean it, or like there's a big list, honestly. I should have used triple equals here, right? So that brings me into a segue on testing in general, and you should definitely be testing. I think testing in JavaScript, it is possible to have a good workflow, but most people do not. And having a good workflow means that you actually run your tests on a regular basis and write them. In Ember, we write like tons of tests. I actually write less tests in JavaScript projects that I start where I have not set up the workflow yet. So like usually one of the first things I do after like a day of work is like, I know it was annoying to set this up, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, like why we should probably make it less annoying. I know it was annoying to set it up, but it's actually important to be able to run tests reliably. So let's get this set up. This is a test in QUnit. Here I have made a mistake, so ember.lowercase view is what I use instead of capital V. So obviously here JS hint can't help us because it doesn't know that there's no ember.capital lowercase view. It only knows, it can only detect leaked globals. So there's going to be a bug here. There's going to be a failure. I've intentionally introduced a failure into this test. If you go run the tests, and I know a lot of people like Jasmine. I actually like Jasmine syntax. I'm like kind of an RSpec person in general. But the Jasmine test runner is so much worse than the QUnit runner, and I'll talk about that as we move forward, that there's just no chance that I can use it. It's like there are important workflow things that are just not there at all. And sadly, having talked to people there, while I think they would like to fix it, is like not a priority at all. So I cannot use it. So anyway, here we have an assertion, like basically Ember is giving you an assertion like you did not pass an instance of view. That's like a pretty opaque warning. In this case, it's you passed undefined, basically. So that's better than getting like ember.meta undefined did something weird, but if you just look at this, the wording of the error might not be so obvious what's going on. What you should do, and this is one of the reasons you should use QUnit, is that there's a feature in QUnit called no try catch, which you can turn on, and then you run your tests again, and then you ran your tests, it doesn't actually run them because there's an exception, and it will immediately bounce you into the debugger as soon as it hits the exception in the place where you are at. So obviously here you can see that we're inside of the Ember assert. And then if you need to basically walk down the stack on the right, so on the upper right hand, how many people know about this feature, like that there is a call stack at all in the browser? Okay, like a lot of people don't. If you write JavaScript at all, like become familiar with the Chrome developer tools. Like I sometimes ask like how many people know that there's like the debugger keyword, like, I'm sorry? Yeah. So Chrome has the feature of not having anonymous functions everywhere, which is like a good feature. Anyway, so you're going to be bouncing here, and like you need to basically go find the line in the stack that is your code, right? Because like probably the first few lines in the stack, like in a Rails app or whatever, is not going to be an exception to your code. It's an exception to your code calling it to some other code. And you can see here that the line is view.createChildView ember.view, and I went in, I type ember.view in the console. So when you're in a stack frame, you can like click around. You always have access to the current context. So you can basically poke around. You can obviously play forward, etc. I actually think that the Chrome debugger is like way better than what we have in Ruby for debugging in general. So you basically can see what's going on, and then you will notice like, hey, ember.view is not ember.capital view. This is wrong. I need to go fix that. And in general, you should definitely be running your tests in a mode, like you should understand enough about the modes available to testing to be able to do useful things with them. Okay, so that's sort of my spiel on tests. Ember actually has a couple of extra things that we do in our tests, like testing JSLint. Ember allows you to run without prototype extensions. So we have a mode, we basically have a testing mode that's like yet with and without, so that we don't accidentally introduce dependency on the prototype extensions in the framework, even though they're available to you. So it would be like if Rails was like, we don't want to use active support anywhere in Rails, would basically be a mode where like active support was disabled for Rails. Right? And then we would know that you could use it without active support, or you could turn it on, then you have it in your app. So in general, I want to go into building a little bit. I talked a little bit about building before when I talked about this, but actually this is like the hello world of useful things you can do with low cost to make a good build. So this obviously gives you some nice features right away. I I think by far the biggest simple thing you can do in a build is something called source URL. How many people have heard of source URL in the browser? A few people? Okay, so you're not really supposed to have to know about it. But unfortunately, because there's not a lot of people that use it in tooling, if you don't know about it, you're not using it. So here, I'll give you an example of source URL. So here you can see that I said, I'm in an about blank, so on the top over there, usually there would be like a bunch of scripts. It's just like an empty list, and I type eval function foo, and then I say source URL equals eval bro on the bottom there. And when I run that code, Chrome actually sees that as a file. It is a file in this inspector, and it shows you as though it was a regular file. So that's basically what the source URL feature is, and it in fact even does stuff like does the right thing in debugging. So here I've just done a simple thing. I threw a debugger in there, and you can see that it landed me on the right line. But you can have multiple files, and exceptions through them will do the right thing. It's basically, as far as Chrome is concerned, it's a legitimate file that came over the network and is going to be treated that way. So actually what you probably want to do in a build system is something like this. So you want to have your file is full of a bunch of calls to something like register a name, and then it has a function inside of it. Notice that the function has that scratchpad scope, and then at the end you would put in a source URL. That register function would basically put all those things into a hash of some kind. So app.js : and then the string. I didn't want to repeat it. And then when you go to require something like app.js, it will basically go. I don't actually ever use jQuery.global eval, but you get the idea. You don't want to eval it in whatever scope you're in. You want to eval in the global scope. You go eval registered app.js, right? So this is a very small. People talk about module systems in the browser a lot. There's several big ones that implement CommonJS. I actually think that you get most of the value of a module system from something like this, because you can then concatenate all your files into a single file, and you get the benefit of Chrome knowing what's going on. And what's especially awesome, is that you basically don't have to worry about. So when you usually in Rails in development mode, you get all the separate script tags, right? And basically what that means is that eventually, if you have hundreds of JavaScript files, the browser's having to load hundreds of script tags. So basically over here, you have the same concatenation logic in development mode and production mode, and Chrome is basically just doing the right thing. Another side benefit of this is if you have files that you don't always use, so you can conditionally require files, right? So you can imagine that there's a login page, and then there's a bunch of different tabs, each with their own chunks of code, and the download time isn't really the problem. The problem is evaluating and parsing all that JavaScript. You might have hundreds of K or a megabyte of JavaScript, and you can easily cache the megabyte of JavaScript, but you're on a mobile device, and you don't want to have to evaluate a megabyte of JavaScript just to boot the app. So you can, if you have this system, with very little code, you now have a system that allows you to lazily load JavaScript that is already in the browser, which is also nice. So I actually have a library called Minispade. This is the entire thing, which basically the top few lines is global eval, because I didn't want a dependency on jQuery, and then there's what you would imagine, put it into a string, blah blah blah, evaluate. And again, I think that there's utility in having something simple that adds this feature. In general, I've used other loaders like CommonJS loaders, and I always run into bugs with them. And I'm what's going on? And I'm debugging code in the middle of a CommonJS loader, and no, I don't need CommonJS. I don't need that feature. I'm loading regular JavaScript files in the browser, so I'm just gonna have something simple. And we use a thing called rake pipeline, which is sort of a replacement for the asset pipeline with more control over what actually happens. Uses rake under the hood to make it relatively fast. And the important thing here is that you can see on line 46, we'll match all the things that are tests, and then there's a filter that's built in called Minispade, which basically just goes in. The important thing there is string true, and then there's module ID generator, which basically just takes the input file and decides what the actual file that you should require in the browser is. So you might have lib in your path, and you actually don't want that to be necessary to require. So it's basically just before I had register app.js, it's how you get from the input file name to app.js. So it's basically, like I said, we do it. I think that this whole system could be better. It's definitely at the like mid-tier infrastructure layer where there could be something better that's a better abstraction. But the basic idea is that there's like a general system of filters that you can easily use. And the point is we use this. This exists today. We and a lot of Ember people use it, and it in fact provides this feature, which I think people should have. I would be happy if someone built it for the asset pipeline, like the feature of basically concatenating files and evaling them and that whole jazz. Yeah, so like I said, this is the important bit. I showed you before that we like run JS hint in all of our tests. Basically, another benefit of having all of your files registered as separate files is that you can basically just go loop over all the files and run JS hint against them, and now you know what exact file caused the bug, right? So if you concatenated everything together, you would have to go like run the entire thing, and then it would be like application.js line 7000. Or somehow you would have to like get all the files that were loaded via script tags. I don't really know how you would do that. But because we already have a list of all the files, we can in test mode just loop over them and do whatever. It's also, if you can see, I think you can see here somewhere on line 153, that's also how we avoid having to type require for all of our test files, right? So we basically loop over them, and if they look like a test, we require them. Okay, almost done actually. So module name, blah. In general, the default JavaScript tooling could be a lot nicer. The point of this is just to show you like there is infrastructure. It could be a lot better. It could be a lot nicer. We definitely need to do some cleanup on what the infrastructure already exists to make it really nice. But in my day-to-day workflow, this is like easily 10x productivity when I start putting these tools into place. In my last 5 minutes, I will sort of pivot into the sort of the hypermedia discussion, but I'm not really talking about hypermedia. So I think that there's another sort of workflow problem, which is how Rails talks to JavaScript in general. And the reason we like Rails in general is because contrary to the claim that we should definitely decouple everything and your database should be different, it's actually, I think, a good thing that your database talks with basically the same attribute names as active record, which then talks to the same attribute names as render JSON. Sometimes that is not a good idea, but if you do it, it basically means that you don't have to do a lot of work to do things that are generally what you want to do anyway, right? So obviously you could do something else. People do it, it's fine. But it's nice that that if all you want is like, I have a first name field, I would like that to be in my JSON. It's basically like fast path. And so we have conventions like the primary key is always ID, table name is always comments, the foreign key is post ID, right? And then when we go to make JSON, we have conventions, there's attributes. We call to JSON on it. It generally works. The thing is that top level of the stack is the same problem. How we go from render JSON to the browser client is the same problem with basically none of the same solutions, right? You get, so in your head, you imagine that it's basically this. You make a new model, you put a method on it, and then you have some data, and then in Rails, you go like make a people controller, and you show it, and you're good, right? I think that's how people imagine it will work, and it basically does work for that case. But there's actually a whole bunch of problems like, should I include the root or not? Who makes that decision? That's basically the equivalent of like, what's the primary key name, right? And now it's like a discussion you have to have. What if you want to include other resources in the request, right? So you want to, do you embed, do you sideload? How do you represent associations? Like if you're representing the same person as associations of multiple things, that's going to be different every single time. How do you deal with lazy population? Like I have a post has 1,000 comments. I don't want to have to include the 1,000 comments, but how do I go about getting the 1,000 comments later without making 1,000 HTTP requests? What if I want to do general bulk loading or bulk saving? So there are actually a bunch of things that don't fit into the nice picture of like, I have a resource, I've rendered JSON. Oh, look, the browser has it, right? There's a whole bunch, mostly dealing with like relational data. And I can give you my opinion on this, but I think we need an answer. So my opinion, which is canonized in the active model serializers gem, is the top part basically looks largely like you would expect, but then instead of embedding the data, so instead of saying author, colon, and then you put the data in there, comments, and then you put the data there, you always associate it with an ID of some kind. And if you can see in this case, for example, that the same authors are used in multiple places, and by associating like this, you avoid having to repeat the data for author all the time. This means that a client has to know how to put this information back together, but it also means that you potentially save like huge amounts of data transfer of things that were the same. just to be nice to the Hypermedia people, I think this is largely the same thing if you want to use hrefs. I'm largely convinced, although there are some practical problems with bulk that have to be resolved, but it's essentially the same, right? Basically, in this case, you're just using an href as the ID, and that's fine. It's basically just there needs to be something to link the things together so that when you parse all the data, you do the right thing. And you can here's another example where you can see it more clearly. Here I have a list of posts. Every post has an author. Imagine you have a blog. The author is always the same. It's a blog post. I am the only author, right? So it's nice to be able to have like the author being repeated, not only once. And this is the same thing using hrefs. Again, I think that's fine. The active model serializer gem, like I said, implements this already. You can see the purpose. It says serializers replaces hash-driven development with object-oriented development. That's actually not as important as the fact that it provides a general convention for I have an object in Rails and I would like to make it available to a client. How do I make it so that that communication is very clean? Ember data, which I'm also working on, I'm just showing this to show out-of-the-box support for Rails apps that follow the active model serializer gem convention. So I'm basically eating my own dog food with active model serializers. I'm saying, okay, what do I have to do to actually make this work? So I don't really care what the client looks like. I'm just making a client that happens to follow the conventions to see if I can prove the point that you can actually make the API nice. So Ember comes with a thing called DS REST adapter, which basically does the work, like figure out what URLs and implements the general Ember data API, which is async. And then there's also a fixtures adapter, which is much simpler and allows you to get bootstrapped quickly with just like local data, pretends to be async, etc. And basically these things are just, again, ways for me to dog food the idea that Rails could use a better convention. And if we build something that is a better Rails convention, then clients will have an easier time understanding what's going on and do the right thing. I hope I illustrated that there's a lot of workflow improvements that are possible and desirable in JavaScript. My biggest gripe with the Rails asset pipeline in general is just that I don't think it really tries to reach for these types of workflow improvements. I think it's like concatenation was too hard-coded. We should make it more decoupled, and that's great. But I think there are workflow improvements that you can make I mean, the biggest problem in JavaScript is that people don't have a build system. They refuse to have a build system. We have one. We should be doing more with it. We should make the JavaScript workflow nice. I think it requires having like a pretty deep sense of what it is that is possible in that environment, but I think if you know it, it's possible to do cool stuff with it. And again, I think in general, getting this stuff done is what I'm working on. It's like why I did the work on the API app, why I do active model serializers, Ember data, all this stuff is basically like what I care about right now. So to the extent that I have any influence over Rails I hope that we do more to make Rails a really good API server. And that means more than just like stripping out middleware, right? It means like, what does that mean to be an API server? So thank you very much. I doubt I have time for any questions. 3 questions. So 3 questions. No questions. Hey, back there. Is there anything I talked about that is not available as open source? There are things that I talked about that are available as open source because we use them in Ember ourselves. So the enhancements to QUnit, like basically the way QUnit wires up to Phantom.js and all that stuff is essentially hard-coded in a rake task in Ember, but you can look at the code. It's there already. I don't know of anything that isn't. I think there's like code on my laptop. I haven't pushed the Ember data yet. But in general, no, I don't really work on infrastructure, like web infrastructure that's not open source. I think that's silly in general. Confirm. Hey, what's up? So given my love of modular code, things are modular. The REST loader in general is like somewhat coupled to the API that is, so basically the adapter and the store in Ember data are adapters in charge of getting data, and then the adapter pushes data into the store. So you could easily implement a like store-alike object that accepted things like, so you say like store.load, you give it a type, you give it a key, you give it a hash, it like indexes it. You could easily write your own, right? But like basically that object, the store object, is the thing that actually manages keeping track of your data. Like, it's basically an ORM, right? So you could definitely implement something simple, and because I like modular code, the API for that is like essentially a public API, right? Adapter to store is a decoupled thing. So we're not going to like randomly add new store things that you don't know about. So most people who use Ember who are successful essentially just say like, Yehuda, what should I do? And I'm like, do this. And they just do exactly that. And they don't, so the thing that I don't like about that is that, for instance, the like rake pipeline is like, if you just copy the one I give you, you will probably be like, oh, this looks like this entire system. What else can I do with it? You'll probably be curious, and then there's like a rabbit hole there, right? So what I would like is to have a system that's built on rake pipeline that does everything you would ever possibly need in a good JavaScript workflow. And again, I'm happy to help anybody who wants to work on the asset pipeline. I don't like that code, but I think in general, like, there is a happy path, which is basically a thing we hate in Rails and I hate in general, which is just like follow these steps, right? Follow these steps and it's good. The only thing that's not true like that right now is the QUnit Phantom.js integration, but like someone should just do that. Probably would take like under a day to like extract it into a usable form. Yeah, I guess there is another option, which is people can help, right? I think unfortunately the JavaScript community is like in a different direction in how to deal with the problem. Obviously, for sure, they're not interested in Ruby tools at all. That was sort of, I meant to say this when I started, like, I guess I can get away with talking about this because all the tools that I'm using are written in Ruby, even though it's a JavaScript talk. But Ruby tooling obviously works better with our workflow than JavaScript, than Node tooling. Like Heroku doesn't necessarily have Node. So in general, I think helping and like caring. I want people to help who care a lot about having a really nice, pleasant workflow that is Rails-like, and I think there is room for that. It's like basically ground floor, right? Like anybody can come in and make a lot of impact in a small time. All right, thank you very much.